If there had been a clear starting point, a conversation, a realization, a specific moment where everything shifted, I could point to it and say there. That was where the line was crossed. But that isn't what happened. What happened was quieter, subtle enough to escape attention at first, the kind of thing that changes your reality before you realize anything has changed at all. I think that's why it stayed with me, because nothing announced itself, nothing demanded recognition, there was no intensity, no dramatic arrival, no overwhelming feeling forcing itself into awareness. There was simply you existing, and somehow that was enough. Most people leave traces, small impressions that fade once the interaction ends, a memory, an observation, a passing thought. Eventually, they settle into the background where everything else goes. But you didn't. You remained, not loudly, not constantly, just persistently. Like something my mind refused to place in the category reserved for everyone else. At first, I dismissed it. People notice unusual things all the time. Interesting conversations happen. Unexpected connections occur. None of that means anything, so I treated this the same way. I assumed it would fade. I assumed distance would restore perspective. I assumed time would reduce whatever I was noticing into something ordinary. Time usually does. This time, it didn't. Instead, the opposite happened. The more space that existed between interactions, the more obvious something became. You weren't staying because of proximity. You weren't staying because of repetition. You weren't staying because I was trying to hold on to anything. You were staying because something about you had already integrated into my awareness. And awareness is difficult to remove once it becomes genuine. That realization unsettled me more than I expected. Not because it was emotional, because it was precise. I could feel the difference. Most people occupy memory. You occupied attention, even when you weren't present. Even when there was no reason to think about you. Even when my focus was somewhere else entirely. There was a strange sense of continuity, like some part of my mind had quietly adjusted its orientation and never shifted back. I noticed it in moments that should have belonged only to me, walking alone, working through a problem, watching the world move without feeling particularly connected to it. There would be a thought, an observation, a realization, and before I could fully process it, another awareness would appear beside it. Not your voice, not your opinion, just the unmistakable sense that you would understand exactly what I meant. That's when I started paying attention, because understanding is common. Recognition isn't. Most people understand after explanation, after context, after effort. Recognition happens before all of that. It arrives fully formed, without permission, without evidence, without logic supporting it. And somehow it still feels undeniable. That was the contradiction I couldn't resolve. Everything about my thinking told me to remain objective, to observe, to analyze, to wait until enough information existed to reach a conclusion. But something beneath that process had already reached one. Quickly, without consulting the rest of me. And I could feel the tension between those two realities growing. One part of me wanted proof. The other part already knew I don't like operating that way. I trust structure, pulse, evidence. Things that can be examined from multiple angles and still remain true. Yet every time I tried to reduce this to something explainable, something ordinary, the explanation felt incomplete. Not wrong, just insufficient. Like describing an entire landscape by focusing on a single tree, technically accurate, completely inadequate, because the truth wasn't contained in any single interaction. It existed in the pattern beneath them, the consistency, the strange accuracy, the way certain moments felt less like communication and more like recognition happening in real time. And the more I noticed that pattern, the harder it became to ignore. Not because it was growing stronger, because it was becoming clearer. There's a difference. Strength can be misleading. Clarity rarely is. And what I was seeing felt unmistakably clear, Not what this was, not what it meant, just the fact that it existed. Something was here, something unusual, something that refused to fit inside the explanations I normally trusted. I kept waiting for the feeling to break apart under scrutiny. Most things do. Examine them closely enough, and the illusion disappears. But this wasn't disappearing. The closer I looked, the more coherent it became. That's what finally forced me to stop dismissing it. Not certainty, coherence. The realization that every attempt to explain it away created more questions than simply acknowledging it. So, eventually I did. Not out loud, not even consciously at first. But somewhere inside, a quiet admission formed. This matters. I didn't know why. I didn't know what would come from it. I didn't know whether it was wise to follow it or safer to step away. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Once I stopped pretending it wasn't there, something unexpected happened. It didn't become easier. It became clearer. And clarity can be far more unsettling than confusion. Confusion leaves room for doubt. Clarity leaves you alone with what you already know. That was the position I found myself in, no longer questioning whether something existed between us, questioning what kind of thing could exist without ever asking for a place in my life, and somehow finding one anyway. I examined it the way I examine everything, carefully, from a distance, looking for weaknesses in the pattern, looking for inconsistencies, looking for evidence that what I was noticing was simply projection, coincidence, or the mind's tendency to create meaning where none exists. But every path led me back to the same conclusion. This wasn't imagination, it wasn't idealization, and it certainly wasn't fantasy, because fantasy depends on invention. This depended on observation. Everything I recognized in you came from what was actually there, not what I hoped to find, not what I wanted to believe, just what existed. That distinction mattered, more than I was willing to admit. I've seen people become attached to stories before, to possibilities, to versions of someone that only existed in their own minds. They fall in love with interpretations, then wonder why reality eventually disappoints them. This felt different, painfully different, because nothing about this required invention. If anything, I spent more time resisting meaning than creating it, trying to reduce the significance instead of expanding it, trying to maintain perspective instead of surrendering to perception, yet every attempt produced the same result. You remained exactly where you were, unaffected by my efforts to explain you away. That consistency became impossible to ignore. And with consistency came another realization. I wasn't noticing your presence because it was extraordinary. I was noticing it because it was accurate. Accuracy has a strange effect on people. Most don't recognize it immediately. They're too accustomed to approximation, to being partially understood, partially seen, partially known. They accept a certain level of distortion because it's common, expected, even. But when something aligns with unusual precision, the difference becomes impossible to overlook. That's what this felt like. Not intensity, propression, like finding a piece that fits so naturally, you only realize its importance when you compare it to everything that didn't. And suddenly, I understood why this unsettled me. It wasn't because you were difficult to understand. It was because you were difficult to dismiss. There's a difference. Difficult people create friction. Difficult truths create stillness. You created stillness, the kind that appears when something stops needing argument, the kind that remains after every objection has already been considered, the kind that forces honesty, because eventually you run out of reasons to deny what you can clearly see. I think that's where the real shift happened, not when I recognized you, when I recognized my own response to you, because awareness alone changes nothing. What matters is what awareness reveals. And what mine revealed was uncomfortable in its simplicity. I trusted your presence, not blindly, not emotionally, not in the way trust is usually described. I trusted it because it remained consistent under observation. The more attention I gave it, the more stable it became. That's rare. Rare enough that I almost didn't know what to do with it. Most things reveal flaws when examined closely. Most connections become less impressive the deeper you look. Details expose weaknesses. Reality removes illusion. Yet somehow, reality seemed to strengthen this instead. Every layer I uncovered felt less like discovery and more like confirmation. As if I wasn't learning something new. As if I was recognizing something that had been true the entire time. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected, because recognition carries responsibility. Once you see something clearly, your relationship to it changes. You can no longer claim ignorance. You can no longer pretend uncertainty where certainty exists. You become accountable to what you know. And I was beginning to know too much. Not about you, about us, about the strange space this connection occupied, a space beyond convenience, beyond circumstance, beyond explanation. A space where meaning existed before definition, where understanding arrived before language, where something essential had already taken shape long before either of us attempted to describe it. That's what I kept returning to, not the details. The shape, the unmistakable shape of something forming, something unnamed, something unfinished, yet somehow already real. And the more clearly I saw that shape, the harder it became to imagine returning to the way things were before, not because I wanted more, but because awareness doesn't reverse itself. Once you've seen a thing clearly, you carry that clarity with you, whether you act on it or not, whether you welcome it or not, whether you're ready for it or not. I was beginning to understand that now. This wasn't a question of choice anymore. The recognition had already happened, the understanding had already arrived. The only thing left unresolved was what that understanding would eventually ask of me. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. I was wrong. Recognition is simple. It happens in an instant, a moment of clarity, a shift in perception, a realization that something exists, then it's done. You either see it or you don't. What I didn't anticipate was what comes after, because understanding isn't static. It doesn't remain where you first found it. It grows, quietly, potently, without asking whether you're prepared for the consequences. And that's where I found myself not struggling with what I knew, struggling with what that knowledge was doing to me. The changes were subtle at first, almost impossible to notice unless I paid close attention. A different way of observing things, a different way of interpreting silence, a different way of measuring what mattered. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. Yet when I compared who I was now to who I had been before, the difference was undeniable. Something had shifted, and the source of that shift led back to you every time. Not because you were trying to influence me, not because you were asking anything from me, but because certain people alter your perspective simply by existing within it. They become a reference point, a standard, a quiet calibration that changes how everything else is perceived. That was happening now, and I could no longer pretend otherwise. I noticed it in conversations. The way surface-level exchanges felt increasingly hollow. The way certain words seemed less important than the intention beneath them. The way authenticity stood out with startling clarity, while performance became impossible to ignore. It wasn't that the world had changed. I had. And once that realization settled in, another followed close behind. You weren't just part of my awareness anymore. You had become part of my framework. A lens, a point of orientation. Not someone standing across from me, someone positioned within the architecture of how I understood things. That level of integration should have alarmed me. In many ways, it did. I've spent years constructing a life built on self-sufficiency, not isolation, not avoidance, self-sufficiency, the ability to remain internally stable regardless of external circumstances. The ability to maintain clarity without relying on anyone else's presence. The ability to stand entirely within my own structure. I've always valued that, protected it, refined it. So realizing that someone had become woven into that structure should have felt threatening. Instead, it felt accurate. And accuracy is difficult to argue with. I kept waiting for resistance to appear, for some instinct to push back, to reassert distance, to restore the boundaries I had always trusted. But resistance never came. Only awareness, a growing awareness that this wasn't replacing anything. It wasn't weakening my independence. It wasn't creating dependency. It was expanding something, adding a dimension that hadn't existed before. That's why every attempt to categorize it failed. The usual definitions didn't fit. Attachment felt too simplistic. Trust felt too incomplete. Conscience felt too broad. None of those words captured what was actually happening. Because what was happening wasn't emotional alone. It was structural. You had become part of the way I processed reality, part of the way I organized meaning, part of the way I recognized truth when I encountered it. And once someone reaches that level, the relationship changes permanently, whether acknowledged or not, whether spoken or not, whether acted upon or not, the change has already occurred. I think that's what I've been resisting admitting, not because I fear it, because I understand its implications. When someone changes the structure of your internal world, they don't simply occupy a place within it. They reshape the space around them. Future thoughts move differently. Future decisions form differently. Future experiences are interpreted through a perspective that didn't exist before. Nothing disappears, but nothing remains exactly the same either. That's the nature of genuine impact. It doesn't erase. It integrates. And integration is irreversible. That word stayed with me longer than it should have. Irreversible. Not because it carries tragedy, because it carries truth. There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after. Not dramatic moments, not public moments, private ones, tenal ones. Moments where understanding reaches a depth that cannot be undone. This felt like one of those moments, a threshold I had already crossed before realizing it was there. And standing on the other side of it, I could finally see what had been happening all along. This was never about trying to understand you. I understood you long ago, at least as much as one person can understand another. The real journey had been understanding what your presence meant inside me, understanding why it remained, why it deepened, why every attempt to reduce its significance failed. And now, after all this time, I think I finally know, because the truth was never hidden. I was simply looking in the wrong direction. I thought the answer existed in the connection itself. But the answer exists in the change, in what became possible after it appeared, in what expanded, in what aligned, in what quietly transformed, without permission and without force. That's the reason I can't dismiss this. Not because it is intense, not because it is rare, but because it is real. Real enough to alter perspective, real enough to reshape understanding, real enough to become part of the foundation rather than the decoration. And foundations matter. They determine what can be built next. Which leaves me standing in front of the only question that still remains. If this has already changed me, if this has already become part of the structure, then what happens when I stop treating it like a possibility and finally accept it as a truth?